Our world is changing. It's time for fresh ideas and new points of view. I'm Jan Appeal, Global Head of Arts and Culture at Chanel. And this is Chanel Connects, bringing together creative game changers from film, art, dance, music, and more.
Can you hear me, Charles?
Yeah, I can.
Hi, Emerald.
Hey, it's so nice to meet you.
It's great to meet you, John.
Great to finally meet you, Anicka.
Thanks for having us.
Some are old friends and collaborators. Others are meeting for the first time. All are focused on what matters most and what's coming next. And now we get to listen in.
Could you tell where my head was at when you found me? Me and you went to hell and back just to find peace.
In this episode, Diane Solway, Head of Arts and Culture Programs at Chanel, moderates a conversation between Anicka Li and John Akomfrah. Artist Anicka Li expands the boundaries of art with work that explores biology, technology, and the merging of the two. Collaborating with scientists, she's created giant kelp lanterns inhabited by robot moths, made art using fungi and microbes, and filled galleries with pungent scentscapes, addressing attitudes to women's bodies. For her recent installation, In Love with the World at the Tate Modern in London, Anicka presented her vision of a new ecosystem, filling the space with flying machines resembling mushrooms and ocean life forms, and with smells relating to the building's history. Anicka connects with pioneering artist and filmmaker John Akomfrah, a founding member of the influential Black Audio Film Collective, which started in London in 1982. Today, he is known for his remarkable films and multi-channel video works exploring the themes of memory, migration, race, climate change, and our relationship with the natural world. John's films are stunning accumulations of image, sound, and feeling. Together, John and Anicka discuss if we are more than human.
Anicka and John, it is great to have you with us today for Chanel Connects. Welcome. Where are both of you speaking to us today from?
Well, it's great to meet you, John. I'm really honored to be on this podcast with you and Diane. I'm actually Encinitas, California, which is in, I guess, San Diego County proper.
Well, equally great to finally meet you, Anicka. I'm in my basement in London, where it seems like I've been for the last 3 years.
Yes, exactly. Well, I could not be more excited about bringing you both together for the first time in conversation. That's a real thrill. So Anicka and John, you're both visual artists with an intense interest in the senses other than sight. Anicka, you've observed that we give too much weight to that which we can only optically observe, and you have made art with scent and many other things. And John, I know that audio is integral to your films, and you've said that there are sonic ways of knowing the world which are as important as other ways. So I wanted to ask you both, how did each of you come to these realizations about other types of perception and the ways that you could use them in your art?
Your name starts with A, Anicka.
Okay.
I think you first.
I'll take an alphabetical order. So I think it's at a very early age as a child, I was very sensorially awakened, not just to the ocular, but to smell, touch, taste. And that was how I was able to detect I was alive. Because a lot of times I think that, when we have these kinds of a relationship with just something purely cognitive, it can make us feel like maybe that we are detached from our bodies, and being able to be grounded in my senses was a way for me to be in touch with my body, but also a kind of physical intelligence that's at work. It was almost like a pure instinct and reflex that's how I would approach what at the time I wouldn't even call art, what I was trying to do. And I wasn't the only one. I think there were plenty of people who were questioning, is this art? And I didn't really defend it as such, because I just thought, well, this is maybe not what that is. And I think that that's allowed me to be so much more nimble and agile in my practice, is not to get hung up on these sort of categorical imperatives of what I'm doing, what I'm not doing.
And John, what about you?
A great answer. Absolutely fabulous answer. I'm slightly in awe. I have to follow that, but I'll have a go. I mean, I think in my case, it was in the presence of the visual and a kind of intense engagement with the visual that I realized that something else was missing, that there was an elsewhere that needed to be accessed. You know, as a child, I went to the Tate literally every weekend almost. And the thing with museums is that when you're in it, you're always surrounded by others. And I realized that it was almost impossible to have a singular relation with the paintings, partly because of the murmurs, the whispers, the conversations around me. You know, and it took me a while to understand that, you know, actually most of the people around me were slightly surprised that a 12-year-old would want to have this engagement with canons of European painting, you know. And it's in their whispers, their sort of sniggers, that I began to understand that there might be more needed than just an engagement with the visual. And I've tried to hang on to that. I've tried to hang on to those primal scenes of shame, if you like, you know, with people going, why is that little black boy in this place? I've tried to hang on to what that meant at the time when I thought I was having the best time of my life, as well as, you know, all the other non-visual ways in which I've found to talk to either myself or to others since, really. It's very important, not just for my work, but for my life.
Turning to your work, Anicka, tell us about your remarkable aerobes, those flying machines that look like giant squid in your recent Tate Museum exhibition. Can you describe them for those listening and talk a little bit about the concept behind them and why you decided to set them loose in the massive turbine hall?
Sure. Well, I work with air a lot, and I was trying to foreground air with this project. And air, to me, is a sculpture in which we inhabit. And that was really the guiding principles going into this project. And so, you know, the aerobes are really a kind of manifestation of so much of how we can activate the air in the turbine hall. They're also filled with helium air, and they're also learning about life through the scent molecules that are also being transmitted throughout the air. So the air is just this incredible space for information sharing. It holds all of our anxieties and fears and potential mates that we may find, you know, pheromonally speaking. And so the air contains not only purpose and potential, but it also contains history, because the air, you know, it's funny, we use this term fresh air often, right? And yet there's no real such thing as fresh air, in the sense that most air is recycled air from, you know, millennia back, since the dawn of time. The embers of Joan of Arc being burned at the stake, and the molecules that we also create today will contribute to future life. And yet it also contains a lot of the atmospheric injustices of who gets to breathe the good air and why. And so the aerobes are a new species I'm introducing into this paradigm. Thinking about the history of the turbine hall, the industrial legacy of London as one of the really early industrial cities in the world, and thinking about the nascent emergence of machines and the evolution. And I wanted to address a multitude of things with this project, one of them being, what if we had a different relationship to machines? Up until now, we've really only thought about machines in a purely capitalistic sort of terms, you know, through the Industrial Revolution. And, you know, our relationship to technology is purely conditioned by capitalism, insofar as we want things to be better, stronger, faster. And in that, in that relationship also contains our fear of machines, right? That we will become obsolete, that they'll take over the world, and then, what function will we have? And I think that, that narrative needs to be rewritten and rethought, because what if we actually had a relationship to machines where there was no utility or function to machines, and that they could just be wild, and that to introduce an idea that we could coexist with these machines versus having to domesticate them and having to enslave them for our purposes, but also to an ability to think about how AI would be developed. Up until now, we've really only focused on pure cognition when we think about machines, this kind of the brain in a vat, the separation of the neural sort of intelligence versus the rest of the body. And I'm trying to foreground an idea of an artificial physical intelligence, because as biological entities, we experience reality through our senses, through our bodies, and there can be no consciousness without the body. And so why wouldn't we try to explore that level of research and development for machines in biological terms? And so these Arabs in the Turbine Hall currently, they're learning through the senses, and they are reading and picking up on heat signatures from the public and visitors that come into the hall, and they're able to gravitate towards different kinds of heat signatures they've never experienced before, and then they will kind of come over to you and be curious and learn through the heat that you're giving off. And through this sense, it's my hope that we can, start building machines in a biologized sense versus a purely cognitive.
So in a sense, you envision them, machines and nature coexisting in harmony.
That's the hope, Diane. That is the hope. At least aligning more biological attributes that we haven't explored in AI development, to be able to use the senses as a springboard into thinking about these machines. But also, as the virus, where in this pandemic, this virus has taught us that, it's scrambling what we constitute as living and non-living. And that sort of, that dialectic is starting to become less and less important. Like, what is living? I mean, the virus is technically not alive. It cannot self-reproduce without a host. And yet it has, it predates most of life on the planet. It regulates all biodiverse life on the planet. And so we have to rethink all of these ideas of what is living and non-living. And I think that really also maps onto machines as well. And so the idea of like, oh, is that machine living or non-living, it doesn't really matter anymore as far as I'm concerned, and it's really about like how we can, coexist, and how and we can welcome and embrace a new species on the planet.
It's so incredible that the two of us are talking, Anicka, because every time you open your mouth and every time I read something, I'm like, wow. We're almost like Siamese twins in some very profound way. And I think that goes all the way to the projects themselves. So I went yesterday to the Tate for the second time to see your turbine installation. And something really interesting happened. It was the final day, so there were lots of people there. And what was written pretty large, what was emblazoned almost across the entire hall, were people just yearning to make a connection with these objects. Are they sentient? Does it matter if they're not? Can we establish communion with them in some way? And I mean, these are really like important things for us to take on board. So when you say in one of your interviews, well, I have this kind of skepticism about whether this stuff should be called art at all. And you think, yeah, actually, these moments, you're right to feel slightly skeptical, because actually the drama of conferring ontological status onto the non-human, can be done in these settings in a way that is very light and gentle and, playful, in a way the minute you say it's art, it kind of puts a dampener on the whole thing. I really enjoyed just watching these moments when people who are grounded in a kind of classical definition of sovereignty, I am a human being, that is a thing, suddenly find themselves at the crossroads of that sovereignty, having to accept precisely what you're saying, that there is a coterminous, indeterminate space in which they and the so-called thing or other are becoming one.
Well,
in an exchange, in a dialogue, sorry.
In defense of art, perhaps, maybe art can also be a place that isn't like fully dissected, in a place of non-conceptual thinking and non-conceptual existence. And that's my hope, of what, someone would experience when they come into the Turbine Hall and be in this space with these Arabs, is that it can, outstrip our sort of like, cognitive abilities to understand exactly what anything is. And just to sort of have experience
to be, right?
Exactly, just to be and experience these without, having to understand exactly what's happening and can't articulate maybe.
John, your latest film, Five Murmurations, is a meditation on the pandemic, but also on the murder of George Floyd and the Black Lives Matter movement. It takes its name from the incredible swirling patterns made by flocks of starlings. What fascinates you about these murmurations, and why did you choose them as a theme for the film?
I quite like and have been trying to develop a practice which borrows from the fields of, science and philosophy, etc., to make things that appear to be not simply products of the human world, but other worlds. And a murmuration is really one of those very beautiful events that you catch occasionally at dusk in certain European countries. I'm sure they're all over the world. And everyone stands there watching, starlings do these incredible dances and choreographies. And like everyone else, I've loved it until I realized that there were actually cris de coeur. They are cries of help, protective strategies. So it's perfectly possible to have something that looks incredibly beautiful, which is also a scene of the disaster, and I wanted that. I wanted to use that as a metonym rather than a metaphor for a film about a project about human cries, a kind of visceral response to a set of events. One of the things that that meant was, for instance, trying to decide what to do with the voice of George Floyd in the 8.5 minutes that it took him to die. And I thought that the question of a murmuration could help really frame, quite literally, that voice, so that it would end up being something incredibly harrowing, but also, quote unquote, beautiful at the same time. And it was important that the two had this dialogue with each other inside the frames of Five Murmurations.
Anicka, you've jokingly remarked that you're the virus's publicist, and a lot of your work has centered on microbiology. You even did a show several years ago that looked at human fears of viral contagion, and you've made art using microbes and viruses. So I imagine the pandemic has been incredibly thought-provoking for you. Have you had any important realizations?
Everything that I thought I knew is starting to really collapse and disintegrate. And that's a wonderful thing in lots of ways, right? Because I don't think that world in 2019, we can't go back to that world anymore. It's over. It's gone. And we need to learn to let go of that. And I think that artists like John and myself, we're really, we're wired to construct new worlds. So this is a way to really not only mourn loss, but also embrace possibilities of new worlds that we can build, and not be so overly morose about having to let go of a former world. That being said, I do want to say one thing about John's film, which is so really elegantly compelling to watch. What really resonated for me with that film is how the senses were really foregrounded, and how they were linked to these patterns of the starlings and the birds, and how it was able to link this kind of multi-species kind of symbiosis, and it makes you rethink your relationship to justice. For example, how can we think about justice in terms of the body and the senses, and in terms of other species, and in terms of ecologies? So the pandemic has really opened that up, and I think that it's forcing us to embrace the porousness of our bodies and the porousness of our thinking. And initially, it is creating a lot of division, but at the same time, I think what's emerging is some sort of melting sort of embrace of knowing that we're all deeply connected. And what we're seeing with the divisiveness is just an example of deep fear of that, connection that we have with each other. We're also seeing, I think, a lot of embrace as well. That isn't maybe as touted in the headlines because that doesn't sell newspapers as much.
Right.
Quite.
Right. I think it's heightened, definitely the sense of other, that you don't want to get it. There's something coming from without that will somehow permeate, as you said. And I think that actually is interesting because in John, of course, you've made many works that are exploring our relationship to the national world, but also the distinctions between human and non-human, especially in your work Vertigo C around attitudes to migrants, for instance. And I thought that was such an interesting work to mention because you contrasted, the brutality of the whaling industry with the experiences of migrants who are crossing the sea out of necessity in search of a better life. I wonder, John, if you could just follow up on that in terms of how you approach, I guess, looking at those distinctions between human and non-human.
I think people have got to a point where they now feel agnostic, skeptical about the claims that somehow a hierarchy can be put into place, which endlessly stresses that they sit on top of some chain of being, at the bottom of which must be all other forms, apparently non-human. Because what they've noticed, and I think this is more instinctive rather than rational, what they've noticed is that the bottom pile can change, so you are allegedly on the top of this species chain, but you could quite easily end up at the bottom of it if you're in a World Trade Center, or on a boat in the Mediterranean trying to get to Europe, or a Vietnamese person who thinks, well, do I stay in Vietnam or go to the States in 1970? To be the victim, the bottom of the pile can very quickly move from an ant and a rat to you. And because of that experience of the last half a century, I think people are also open for these investigative insights that the work of Anicka and myself, I think, embodies, right? Which is this deep affinity, almost voodoo affinity, with the sense that things must be shared. That the space of being has to be conferred broader, more democratically, if you will, than it has been till now. And it's, in a way, what leads to projects like Vertigo C, when you suddenly realize that actually, yes, there are differences, huge and profound and fundamental differences between being a whale and a Nigerian, but that actually, when it comes to some pretty profound ones, there are not many. One, you can both drown at sea, and that the reasons why you drown at sea are kind of quite connected. The differences appear not as vast when you realize that the technologies that produced the boating that rendered certain African beings subject to subjugation in the New World were exactly the same technologies that led to the cetacean genocides of the 17th and 18th and 19th century. The boats are the same.
I actually have a question for you, John. When you're talking about the human and the non-human, how attached are you to the grand narrative of the human, the way that humans have evolved in thinking about our own exceptionalism and how we left the nature cosmos and how we separated ourselves from the natural world, and then we created a domain that exists outside of nature, which is, the human domain. I think that we can all probably agree that with all of these new scientific research, AI research, that those narratives aren't exactly accurate, and we have to constantly update. And so I have had to let go of a lot of my conditioning to those kinds of Genesis narratives, and I feel like that is really at the core of my work, of what I'm trying to do, is trying to reset, reorient what is human nature and what constitutes the human, and this notion of what the human doesn't even really exist from the perspective of microbiology. We're mostly microorganisms that are, mostly virus, fungi, microbes. And this substance called the human is actually kind of negligible in lots of ways. And yet that substance is fulfilled through a narrative.
No, I hear you. I mean, and this is, very astute of you, because I think you fingered the key fault line in the practice, really, in the work. And it has been, to be honest, from the beginning, because the initial research of the collective was really about trying to figure out how, in this broad demarcation of something called the cultural and the natural, roughly sometime in between the 12th and the 15th century, this figure, this thing, the human, emerged, and what attributes it was said to be endowed with. And the reasons, of course, why that was important for us then as young people of color was because we were trying to find answers to why, the self-evident humanity of our being just wasn't taken account of in racist discourse or racialized discourses about what constitutes the human. So I've had at best an ambivalent relation with the category, because I realized that it had this policing, if you will, function in the biopolitical sphere. Now, I mean, I would say that I'm not attached to it. I'm prepared to let go. But what I'm very keen on is trying to wrestle with the key question of sovereignty that underpins it, right? This key question of will and sovereignty, because everything is tied around that.
Yeah.
And it's that sovereignty that I want democratized. It's that sovereignty that I want dissented. It's that sovereignty that I think we need to spread, slightly more thinly than it has been.
I've always thought of the human as a kind of glorified condominium for these microorganisms in a way. And so we're having to constantly rethink the grand narrative of what we are, who we are. And it's increasingly apparent that we are more than human, that we are something altogether different, and that maybe language is just like a couple of, decades behind. My I guess like worldview is really grounded on the fact that we're all interconnected and that there can be no real ethics without that basic understanding and acceptance.
Quick question to Anicka. Have you had any major disasters when preparing exhibitions?
Every time. My installations are incredibly complex, and you're working with living organisms as part of your artwork. Some more consensual than others, and and so there's a lot of volatility and instability that comes with that. I've had difficulties with growing microbes in Switzerland. It's a very clean country.
That's really funny.
I was trying to grow microbes, and it just wouldn't grow, and it took me like weeks. But then on the flip side of that, I just remember a project in Yokohama where it was almost, I couldn't contain the microbial growth. And so yeah, there's a lot of that kind of, negotiating with these materials.
You've both, created work that addresses these huge societal issues, race, migration, global warming, and many other things. What do you think artists are uniquely able to do on such important topics that, say, scientists or activists cannot?
Can I respond to that?
Yes,
I think that artists can actually demand the impossible. I think that artists can ask for things in manners of technology where it seems that it's the limits of physics or biology or something, and we can really push through a lot of those kinds of logistics and then figure out how they can be translated and met. So we can actually set the bar pretty high. And this is something that I hope that more artists will do, engage with technology and science. And not allow, let's say, Silicon Valley to lead the discussion on this. Let's get in the game, people. Let's get in the conversation, artists. This is why, the Turbine Hall project was so important to me, because on a level that it was proof of concept that this can be done, and that we brought together 3 different kinds of radically new technologies that had never been merged before into these fully autonomous flying machines. Perhaps the art audience may not be as interested, but I can tell you right now that it's a huge milestone what we accomplished, and this is something that I'm hoping that more artists can do. To push the boundaries and the limits of what is possible beyond like budgetary considerations or something like that. So I think that's really, really important for artists to be at the table when we're talking about where is civilization heading. And it shouldn't just be the technologists and the politicians and the scientists. I think artists should be very much engaged with that conversation.
Really, it speaks to, I think, the work that both of you do, which is that you always present us with something to think about that forces us to look at the world a little bit differently, or to question the way we have always understood things. And I think it's just creating those spaces for questions that's so important.
Yeah, but I would add to that, Diane, that for me, where I'm coming from, it's not just to throw it in people's faces like, oh, look, there's a new world, get on board. It's like, we're all here together. Let's on board together. And I don't want to put that message out that I'm being antagonistic, like people need to just catch up to where we're, like enlightened or something. It's not about that. It's an incredibly there's a generosity where I'm coming from that extends to everybody, because these are ideas and concerns that everyone has a stake in.
For escape during this pandemic, what TV shows are you binging? when you're not imagining the future of the world.
This is an easy one, Diane. I am watching Terrace House. It is a Japanese reality TV program. It's like television as ASMR. It's just nothing's happening all day long. These people are living together, 6 people in a house, and they're doing literally the bare minimum of just cooking their meals, learning how to play the guitar. There's no drama, and people aren't rude to each other. They're not trying to compete with each other. It's very soothing, and it's a world that is pre-pandemic. So it's like this kind of like nostalgia for like 2019 world of no cares in the world. And our fears seemed so minor back then, right, compared to now. It's literally just watching ambient television like a goldfish, you know? I really find it fascinating and very comforting to watch. So that's what I'm binging. Terrace House.
John, what about you?
Oh, I mean, mine not even as highbrow as that. I am really lowbrow, like super lowbrow.
Oh, no, go low. TV. Go low. What's low?
Football. I mean, it's the most mindless, kind of attachment and pretty predictable for a man in this, early 60s. But I have to say, the absence of drama, the absence of story editing and all of that, the trappings of what television has become, the secessions and all of that. I just can't bear it anymore. So I watch football. I mean, any kind of football, just this like lack of planning and organizing and, 3 acts and all of that. I just find it so fascinating. Just do precisely what Anicka's talking about. Just vegetate.
But I share that sentiment, John. Like I want, when I'm not quote unquote working, I don't want to be intellectually engaged.
Everything just feels so super organized, and I just want a bit more chaotic.
So you want the mayhem of sports?
Yeah, I'd like a bit more mayhem. As I see when I go outside, it just everything just feels as if it's so super excluded from the outside world, and I just find the fakeness of it really difficult to take at the moment. I must admit, it's just now. I mean, 2 years ago I was into it, but right now I just like, give me football.
I would love to, obviously thank Anicka Li and John Akomfrah. Thank you so much for connecting with us today. I think it's thrilling that you two actually got to meet and have a conversation, and I hope this is just the beginning.
I love this. Thank you so much for the bringing us together, Diane. It's been such a privilege, and I think that like what John said earlier about us being like these Siamese twins, it was so touching to hear, but also it really mitigates the loneliness of being an artist sometimes, when you feel this resonance with another person. Thank you for doing what you do, John.
I hope we get a chance to do this some more.
Thank you for listening to Chanel Connects. Don't forget, you can follow the show on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, Amazon Music, or your favorite podcast app. You can also listen back to Season 1, featuring conversations between Pharrell Williams and Ez Devlin, Keira Knightley and Lulu Wang, and many more.